Okay, so today we're going to talk about socio-emotional development in adolescence. That was covered in chapter 10 of your textbook. And one of the biggest topics in socio-emotional development in adolescence is identity. And in the adolescent period is where a person, male and female, try to figure out who they are in relation to their parents and their peers and themselves and the larger world. And that is only possible with certain developmental skills in place, certain cognitive developmental aspects. And there's a lot of different kinds of identities. We used to just think of identity as one thing, but what we understand now is that identity is actually a self-portrait with a lot of different pieces, just like intelligence has a lot of components. Okay, Erikson, one of the bigger names in developmental theories and in the idea of identity, was the first to really understand how important identity was in adolescence. And he actually was the first to coin the term psychosocial moratorium, which was later used by Marcia in his work. And he said in the fifth stage of development that the whole job of an adolescent was to figure out their identity, or if they didn't, they would end up in identity confusion. And so the crisis of that period, and this is how Erikson set up his stages of development, is that there was a goal for each stage, and there was a crisis that triggered the goal or the focus on the goal. In this case, because of the exploration of identity, that's what triggers the whole process of determining whether at the end of the stage you've figured out an identity or you're still in identity confusion. And the commitment involved is your personal effort in determining your own identity. He did a number of studies looking at adolescents that he saw as patients that he interviewed, and found consistently that this was part of the process for adolescents. All right. Now, following up with Erikson's work is Marcia, who took the idea of identity moratorium and decided that actually there were other kinds of identity besides moratorium. One of the identities that, four statuses that he identified, was called identity diffusion. And this is where, similar to what Erikson called confusion, where they don't really know yet who they are and what they want because they haven't had a crisis or made a commitment that's forced them to choose an identity. And they tend to be kind of uninterested and vague about not only occupational but ideological, which would include religious and values, those kind of choices. In the status of identity foreclosure, they've made a commitment, but they've not experienced a crisis. And this generally happens to kids whose parents have decided their identity for them. You're going to do this, you're going to college next, you're going to get married, I'm going to pick your bride. Those are the kind of situations, usually with authoritarian instead of authoritative parents, that a teenager ends up in identity foreclosure. And that they really don't get a chance to explore on their own because their parents have decided for them. Okay. So then, of course, there's Erikson's identity moratorium, which Marcia recognized as one of the four possible statuses. In this case, they're in the midst of a crisis, but whose commitments, their commitments are either absent or vaguely defined. They're kind of in delay. Moratorium means delay. They know they want to change, they know they want to move towards an identity, but they haven't kind of figured out what their goal or commitment is towards that identity. And identity achievement, which is not as common as people think it is in adolescence, is actually much more common in early to mid-20s, and in the stage we call emerging adulthood, that they've undergone a crisis and they've made a commitment. This you see much more commonly in early to mid-20s, students who've decided to go to grad school, students who've gotten a job right after college, and so there is some developmental parallels. You see more diffusion and moratorium in the younger adolescents, and you see more identity and foreclosure in the older adolescents. Okay. All right. So one of the things that your textbook talks about is that more recent research has come to understand that just because you resolve your identity at some point in adolescence doesn't mean that it's going to be the same identity all through your life. As a matter of fact, we know that people can have an average of 5 careers in their lifetime. So we also now understand that your identity can change. The mom who goes back to school after having kids and decides that she wants to become a nurse, or had the senior who handed his construction company over to his kids at 65 and decided he wanted to become a geriatric social worker. So that's one of the things that that more recent research and development has begun to understand, that we actually can reevaluate our identity at a number of places during our lifetime, and that these cycles can actually repeat themselves. We might find ourselves in foreclosure, we've decided, or someone's decided for us, and then we have an opportunity to achieve an identity different than what our parents gave us. Then maybe we hit midlife crisis, and we're in moratorium because we're not sure if this is what we want to do the rest of our lives. So it very much parallels that spiral, where in each of the bends in the spiral there is an opportunity for change. All right, now remember the list at the beginning talked about different kinds of identities. So one particular kind of identity that is common in a nation like America, where we have so many people from different cultural backgrounds, is what they call ethnic identity in their textbook. And this is that enduring aspect of yourself that is related to membership in an ethnic group, right? And along with the attitudes and the feelings related to that membership, that could also be religious practice as well, but it's more generally considered to be cultural practices of that specific ethnic group. You see people clinging to their original ethnic identity in some situations, but you also see adolescents very frequently identifying with both their ethnic group of origin and their ethnic group of peers. And those are often people from different cultures. So you often see this, what they call bicultural identity, where they identify with the majority culture that they live with, but they go home and the parents expect them to keep up the practices of the ethnic culture that they came from as well. Sometimes so they're kind of straddling two cultures. Now, in immigrant groups in particular, there's some differences between first and second generation adolescents. And what they found is that if they're first generation, they usually stick with their original identity much more easily. It's less of a challenge or crisis for them. They actually may never try to develop a new identity in the new place that they're living. But in second generations, the kids of first generation immigrants, they frequently see themselves as American, and often their parents will tell them that they're American. It's very commonly the case that up until very recently, the last 20, 30 years, where cultural identity has become a hotter topic, that parents would not even teach their children the language that they brought over with them from their native country. For instance, I was never taught Arabic, even though my father spoke it, because he wanted us to feel like Americans and not have an accent growing up. So there's been some shifts culturally, and there's more interest in affording their children not only access to the language, but access to the culture as well. So they tend to be more bicultural, those second generation immigrants. And if they see themselves in terms of their ethnic origin, it's usually either the language or the social networks from that culture that they're still tied to in some way. Okay. Now that leads us to autonomy and attachment, which is related to identity, but it's also tied to their sense of independence. And that sense of independence is definitely tied to seeking an identity, but it also has to do with finding their place on their own. So if they're allowed to make reasonable decisions for themselves, with a parent there in the background supporting them, then you get less of the risk-taking behaviors that you see more commonly in adolescence as well. Because part of what risk-taking is about is the search for autonomy. So we do, in our Western cultures, generally give more freedom to explore their autonomy as part of their identity search to boys than we do to girls. And we also have some data, some research now, that shows that a good, secure attachment to the parents makes it more likely that the child will be able to still maintain their relationship with their parents while they start to go out in the world and kind of search for their identity and their independence, their autonomy.